Hi class, let's start a discussion on bacterial growth. So first, let's talk about some of the nutrients, the nutrition that our microbes will need to have their growth. An essential nutrient is one that is mandatory, it is required, and it has to be provided. If that nutrient is missing, that organism will die. Of our essential nutrients, we have macro and micronutrients. Macronutrients are essential nutrients that are required in relatively large concentrations. These macronutrients, generally speaking, are going to play a principal role in the cell structure and metabolism. These are the essential building blocks. You can think of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, so on and so forth. There's also phosphorus and sulfur mixed in, and nitrogen as well mixed in there. And then we have our micronutrients. These are also known as our trace elements, or trace minerals in our microbes. They are still needed for microbial growth and survival, but if they are missing for a short period of time, the microbe can tolerate it. These guys are going to be absolutely essential for enzyme function or routine maintenance of the protein structure. These are going to be your much more difficult to find nutrients: copper, manganese, zinc, tin, nickel, so on and so forth. These are going to be at low concentrations. We can also categorize our nutrients and our microbes as an organic or an inorganic nutrient. An inorganic nutrient is any simple compound that does not contain carbon atoms. So you can think of just hydrogen, just sulfur, just zinc all by itself, or it can be a small molecule or a small ionic compound that doesn't contain carbon in it. For example, you could think of sulfates or phosphate ions, or you could think of sodium chloride. These inorganic nutrients can often be thought of as just minerals. In other terms, or organic nutrients are going to contain carbon atoms. These organic nutrients are also known as organic compounds. The simplest organic compound is methane, and there's two notable exceptions: carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide. Even though they do have carbon, they don't have carbon plus those hydrogen atoms, so they're going to be categorized as an inorganic nutrient. These organic nutrients can form simple or large molecules. They form the four biomolecules that we talked about in Chapter 1, our carbohydrates, our lipids, our proteins, and our nucleic acids. Now, if we look at a chemical analysis of a typical microbe, the vast majority of its cytoplasm is going to be water. That makes sense. The liquidy part of the cell is, well, mostly liquid. Now, if we remove all of the water from the cell, we dry it out, we mummify the cell, most of what's left over is going to be a protein. Over half of the dry weight of the cell is a protein. Proteins make up those organic compounds. All the organic compounds, the proteins, lipids, carbohydrates, and nucleic acids, make up approximately 97% of the dry weight of the cell. The other 3% of the dry weight of the cell, and this is of course after we remove the water, that remaining 3% is going to be trace inorganic compounds. Now, if that was a molecular breakdown of the cell, if we look at an elemental breakdown of the cell, and this is also going to be dry weight of the cell, so we've removed all the water. The most common element is carbon, followed by hydrogen, followed by oxygen, then nitrogen, then phosphorus, then sulfur, and it makes a great acronym, SCHNAPS. It sounds kind of like that alcoholic beverage, except you have a CH at the beginning instead of an SCH at the beginning. Most of these elements that are in the cell are not going to be in the cell or picked up by the cell as individual pure elemental substances. The cell doesn't go around and go, ooh, here's a pile of carbon, I need to eat a couple carbon atoms. Ooh, here's a pile of sulfur, I need to eat a couple sulfur atoms. Instead, the cell is going to eat molecular compounds, or more complicated molecules that contain a combination of these individual elemental compounds. So instead of walking over to a pile of carbon and eating a couple of carbon atoms, the cell is going to go over to, let's say, a carbohydrate and consume some of the carbohydrates that contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Or the cell may go over to a piece of a protein or a piece of protein tissue or muscular tissue and consume proteins that contain carbons, hydrogens, oxygens, nitrogens, phosphates, and sulfurs, so on and so forth. So the cells typically are going to consume complex molecules made of multiple elements as opposed to individual pure elements. But using these individual pure elements that the cell gets from the molecules or the compounds that it eats, the cell's able to rip apart those molecules that it eats and rebuild them to make a very wide variety of different chemical compounds. To date, there's been over 5,000 different chemical compounds identified inside of a typical microbial cell. So, here's a figure that talks about what we've already talked about. If we look at the percent dry weight of the cell, it's actually slightly over half proteins. We have a lot of nucleic acids, we have some carbs, we have some lipids, we have some 3% of the dry weight of the cell is inorganic compounds other than water, because we removed all the water by definition for the dry weight of the cell. And if we look at that dry weight of the cell, we have lots of carbon, lots of oxygen, lots of nitrogen, hydrogen, and phosphorus, and sulfur. Schnapps. And then you can throw in potassium and sodium if you want as well. And then we have trace metals. If we combine all of the trace metals in the cell, we are going to have 0.3% of the dry weight of the cell as all of the other trace metals in that cell. So the manganese, the tin, the copper, all of these things at very low concentrations. So if we look at the food that the microbes eat, microbial nutrition in terms of just a food source and where they get their food from, we can categorize our microbes in terms of where they get their carbon and in terms of where they get their energy. Organisms that get their carbon from organic forms are always going to be referred to as heterotrophs. You could think of a heterotroph as something that needs to eat, so to speak. This is going to be your stereotypical microorganism that consumes what we consider stereotypically to be food. So it needs to eat some carbohydrates. It needs to eat some proteins to get its carbon from those organic forms. An autotroph, on the other hand, is an organism that can utilize inorganic carbon, like carbon dioxide or carbon monoxide. These autotrophs get their carbon from the atmosphere or from inorganic sources in the soil. These organisms do not need to eat other living things or other things that are dead. So when we think of our classic autotrophs, we think of something that will go through photosynthesis, because that's what we have lots of exposure to. They get their carbon from the atmosphere, and they get their energy from the sun. Any organism that can photosynthesize is called a phototroph. It gets any organism that uses photons of light for its energy source is a phototroph, and if it uses carbon dioxide as its carbon source, it's an autotroph. So if we looked at a classic plant or a tree, it would be a photoautotroph. It uses light for the energy, inorganic carbon for the food, and then as its carbon source, and that's how it gets its nutrition. Chemotrophs get most of their energy from chemical compounds. We as human beings are chemoheterotrophs. We get our energy from chemical compounds. We don't photosynthesize. And we get our carbon from organic forms. We need to eat something to get carbon in our body. We can't take carbon in from the atmosphere, thankfully, depending on your viewpoint. Here's a table breaking down the mixing and matching the different combinations. So if we had a photoautotroph, that would be something that uses the sun and uses carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. If we had a chemoautotroph, this is going to be something that's pretty hard to find. These are typically going to be in deep sea vents. They were unknown of until the 1970s. These are organisms that use an inorganic carbon source and get their energy from sulfur and nitrogen containing chemical compounds at the bottom of the ocean from deep sea volcanic vents. We also have photoheterotrophs. These are going to be organisms that get their energy from the sun and have an organic carbon source. Those will be your purple or green photosynthetic bacteria. And if you want to look at an animal source, you could think of a photosynthetic sea slug, which, Google it on your own, read about it on your own when you have some leisure time. Photosynthetic sea slugs are amazing. And then finally we have our chemoheterotrophs, organisms that need organic carbon and need to eat food for energy. So we as human beings would fall into this category, and we'd also be right there with that animal right there. And we'd have our protozoa fungi. Now, within that fungal category, we'll have, in the bacterial category, we have our saprobes that specialize on eating dead organisms, and then we have our parasites, which specialize on eating live organisms. So as I mentioned before, we have our photoautotrophs, organisms that are photosynthetic. We have our chemoautotrophs. Wow, I really just spent a lot of time on this last slide talking about this slide. So we'll go quickly on this slide. Chemoautotrophs are going to use inorganic carbon for their source, for the carbon source, and they use organic compounds for energy. We can have our chemoorganic autotrophs, or we can have our lithoautotrophs. Lithoautotrophs rely totally on inorganic materials and require neither sunlight nor organic nutrients. So think of these as those organisms that are capable of living at the bottom of the ocean, whereas our chemoorganic autotrophs that use organic compounds for energy and inorganic compounds as a carbon source are going to be a little bit more diverse in their skill set for their environments that they can live in. Our chemoheterotrophs need food. Organic carbon for food, and they need to have essentially a food source for energy. Our saprobes need to eat something that's dead. You can think of our saprobes as our decomposers on our food chain or food pyramids. And then we have our parasites. Our parasites, the parasites. These guys cause a lot of problems for us as human beings. Our diseases come from, generally speaking, parasites. When we think of a bacteria that's living off of a human being, or that bacterium is going to be a parasite. Parasites, by definition, benefit at the expense of their host. So when we look at these bacterial species are helped by taking nutrients or nutrition from us, their human host, and then we as the human host suffer ill effects or ill consequences from the parasites doing that to us. So when we think of a parasite, I want you to think of a pathogen, something that causes disease. They can be something as small as a virus or something as large as a helminthes. We have an ectoparasite, the ecto meaning outside, parasite, well, we've already talked about what parasite means. So an ectoparasite lives on the outside of our body, the host's body. Endoparasites are going to live, endo meaning in, live inside of the host body, either in the organs of the host or the tissues of the host. Or we can have intracellular parasites. These intracellular parasites are going to live inside of the cell of the host. These could be the leprosy bacilli bacterium or the syphilis spiroret, or you can have the mycobacterium, or if you think of an intracellular parasite, think of a virus. All viruses are going to be intracellular parasites. We also have obligate parasites. Any parasite that is unable to grow outside of the host, that must have that host, it's obligated to have the host in order to grow, it's going to be an obligate parasite. Obviously, most parasites are going to be obligate parasites in that they must have the host to grow. Here is a breakdown of the essential nutrients in a lot of detail of our carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphate, and our sulfur. Something that I should emphasize for you here is phosphate is an inorganic ion made of phosphorus and oxygen. Let's talk about what these main nutrients do for us. Carbon is the main backbone of all of our biomolecules, our carbohydrates, our proteins, our lipids, and our nucleic acids. Hydrogen is also a major element present in all molecules of the body. These hydrogens help to maintain the body's pH, and also is useful for forming hydrogen bonds that help to hold large macromolecules together, and is also used as a source of energy if we have lots of carbon-hydrogen bonds. Oxygen is also going to be a major component in our carbs, our lipids, our proteins, and nucleic acids. It is also going to be a terminal electron receptor for our aerobes, and oxygen makes up a large component of the water molecules that is in the cell, in addition to the hydrogen. Think H2O, water. Nitrogen is going to make up lots and lots of our nucleic acids and our proteins. Nucleic acids and proteins have very high concentrations of nitrogen in them. A few bacteria are capable of taking nitrogen from the atmosphere and converting it into a form that's biologically available. Those are known as nitrogen-fixing bacteria. And those have a very important role in the nitrogen cycle, which is something that you could talk about in a geology class or an intro to biology class. Phosphate is going to be in high concentrations in nucleic acids. So whenever we have high concentrations of phosphate, we are going to have high concentrations of genetic information. Phosphate is an inorganic polyatomic ion that has a concentration, a chemical formula of PO4 with a -3 charge. Hydrogen phosphate, or phosphoric acid, is H3PO4 and is an inorganic source of phosphate. Finally, sulfur is a molecule, is an element that's in high concentrations in our proteins, and a key role sulfur plays in our proteins is by forming disulfide bridges to hold the tertiary structure of proteins together. Other important nutrients that are present in the cell include sodium, and that's used for cell transports. Depending on the kind of cell transport, you can have either active or passive. Calcium stabilizes the cell wall in the cell walls of our bacterium and the endospore barrier in bacterium. Magnesium, Mg, is the central element in the chlorophyll pigments in photosynthetic bacteria and helps to stabilize and maintain cell membranes and ribosomal structure. Iron is important in an important component in the cytochrome proteins that serve as electron carriers in the electron transport chain of cellular respiration. Zinc is a regulatory element for eukaryotic genetics. There is something known as a zinc finger, and these zinc fingers are loops of amino acids with the zinc in them that activate or deactivate genes in the eukaryotic nuclear genome. So, concept check. Which of the following describes an organism that derives its energy and carbon from organic molecules? Would it be a photoautotroph, a chemoheterotroph, a lithoautotroph, a chemoautotroph, or a photoheterotroph? If you need to, you can rewind the video or flip back in your PowerPoints, pause the video, and find the answer right now. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The answer is B, a chemoheterotroph. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to shoot me an email or post them on the discussion board. Happy studies!